Judge Patricia Williams adjusted her wire-rimmed reading glasses and leaned back in her leather chair, staring at the most unusual motion she'd encountered in her 20-year judicial career. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of her chambers at Franklin County Courthouse in Columbus, Ohio, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk laden with case files. But this particular file had kept her attention for the past hour, and frankly, it was giving her a headache. Rodriguez v. Rodriguez. Motion to allow therapy animal in courtroom proceedings. The very title seemed absurd. In all her years presiding over family court, she dealt with contentious custody battles, bitter divorces, and traumatized children, but never had someone requested to bring a dog into her courtroom. Judge Williams prided herself on maintaining the dignity and solemnity of legal proceedings. Her courtroom was known throughout the county for its strict decorum and professional atmosphere. The case file painted a disturbing picture. Emma Rodriguez, 8 years old, had been caught in the crossfire of her parents' increasingly hostile divorce for the past 6 months. According to the psychological evaluations, the child had developed selective mutism, a trauma response, where she'd stopped speaking to all adults entirely. Teachers, counselors, social workers, even her own grandparents couldn't get a word out of her. The only communication came through her interactions with Bailey, a golden retriever assigned as her therapy animal by Child Protective Services. Dr. Sarah Chun's report was particularly compelling. Emma exhibits classic signs of trauma-induced selective mutism. She communicates freely with Bailey through whispered conversations, demonstrating that her vocal abilities remain intact. The child appears to feel psychologically safe only in the presence of her canine companion. Any attempt to separate them results in increased anxiety, physical symptoms of distress, and complete emotional shutdown. A knock on her chamber door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, removing her glasses and rubbing her tired eyes. Margaret Foster, the court's veteran bailiff, entered with her usual no-nonsense demeanor. "Your Honor, the attorneys for the Rodriguez case are here. They're requesting a conference before tomorrow's hearing." "Send them in, Margaret." This should be interesting. Within minutes, 3 lawyers filed into her chambers. Sarah Martinez represented Maria Rodriguez, the mother, a sharp-dressed woman in her early 40s with kind eyes but a determined jaw. Across from her sat Robert Thompson, a burly man with silver hair, representing David Rodriguez, the father. Between them, almost as if symbolically, sat Jennifer Walsh, the court-appointed guardian ad litem tasked with representing Emma's best interests. "Your Honor," Thompson began before anyone was fully seated, "this dog motion is absolutely ridiculous. We're talking about a court of law, not a petting zoo. My client has a right to a proper legal proceeding, not some circus act." Judge Williams held up her hand. "Mr. Thompson, I haven't made any decision yet. Ms. Walsh, this is your motion. Explain to me why you believe a dog belongs in my courtroom." Jennifer Walsh opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Your Honor, Emma Rodriguez hasn't spoken to any adult in 6 months. Not her parents, not her teachers, not even to me, her own advocate. The psychological evaluations clearly show that her silence isn't defiance or stubbornness. It's a trauma response. The only time we see any normal childhood behavior from Emma is when she's with Bailey. But surely there are other ways to help the child communicate," Martinez interjected. "Play therapy, written responses, drawings. We've tried everything," Walsh continued, her voice gaining strength. "Emma won't draw anything but dark scribbles. She won't write responses. She sits completely frozen when questioned by adults. But with Bailey present, she whispers to him constantly. The therapy dog handlers believe she's processing her emotions through these conversations." Judge Williams leaned forward. "And you believe that having this dog present will somehow make her testify?" I believe it's our only chance of hearing from Emma at all, Your Honor. And frankly, shouldn't Emma have a voice in determining her own future? She's the one who will live with the consequences of this custody decision. Thompson scoffed. This sets a dangerous precedent. What's next? Emotional support peacocks? Therapy horses? Where does it end? It ends with protecting a traumatized child, Mr. Thompson. Walsh shot back. Bailey isn't just any pet. He's a specially trained courtroom therapy animal from Canine Companions for Independence. He's worked with over 50 children in legal proceedings across 3 states. He's trained to remain calm during emotional testimony, to provide grounding for anxious witnesses, and to never disrupt proceedings. Judge Williams studied the documentation. Bailey's credentials were impressive. The 3-year-old golden retriever had undergone 2 years of specialized training beyond basic obedience. His certifications included stress detection, emotional support protocols, and courtroom behavior standards. The dog had even passed background checks, if such a thing could be believed. Your Honor, Martinez spoke up quietly, I've seen Emma with this dog. My client brings Emma for our meetings, and it's like watching 2 different children. Without Bailey, Emma sits like a statue, staring at nothing. With Bailey beside her, she actually shows signs of life. She pets him, whispers to him, even occasionally smiles. Thompson remained unconvinced. Even if we allow this unprecedented arrangement, what makes anyone think the child will suddenly start talking? She's been silent for months. Because children often communicate differently when they feel safe, Walsh explained. Emma talks to Bailey constantly when adults aren't pressuring her. Court stenographers have documented instances where Emma has been overheard discussing complex emotions and situations with Bailey. She's not mute, she's protecting herself. The room fell silent as Judge Williams weighed the arguments. Through her chamber's windows, she could see the courthouse steps where media crews were already setting up for tomorrow's hearing. Word had leaked about the unusual custody case, and reporters were calling it the Silent Girl Trial. The pressure to make the right decision felt enormous. I need to see this child, Judge Williams finally announced. Bring Emma and Bailey to my chambers. I want to observe their interaction myself before I make any decision about tomorrow's proceedings. 15 minutes later, the most unusual meeting in Judge Williams' career was about to begin. The door opened slowly, and in walked 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez, clutching the leash of a magnificent golden retriever, whose calm brown eyes seemed to take in everything at once. The moment that would change everything was about to unfold. 6 months earlier, the Rodriguez family looked like any other middle-class household in suburban Columbus. Their modest 2-story home on Maple Street boasted a white picket fence, carefully tended flower beds, and Emma's colorful chalk drawings still visible on the front sidewalk. But behind the American dream facade, cracks had been forming for years, and by winter, those cracks had become an irreparable chasm. Maria Rodriguez clutched her coffee mug with both hands as she sat in her attorney's office. Her emergency room nurse scrubs wrinkled from another grueling 12-hour shift. Dark circles rimmed her brown eyes, and her usually perfect ponytail hung loose and disheveled. At 34, she looked a decade older, worn down by months of legal battles and sleepless nights worrying about her daughter. Tell me again about the drinking, Sarah Martinez said gently, her legal pad ready. The experienced family law attorney had seen hundreds of custody cases, but something about Maria's quiet desperation struck her deeply. It started small, Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. A beer after work became 3 beers. Then it was a 6-pack every evening. By last Christmas, David was finishing a bottle of whiskey every few days. She paused, staring out the window at the gray February sky. Emma started asking why Daddy fell asleep on the couch every night. How do you explain alcoholism to a 7-year-old? Maria's phone buzzed with a text from her current boyfriend, James, asking about dinner plans. She quickly silenced it, knowing that David's lawyers would use any evidence of her new relationship against her. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been lonely for years while married to David. But now that she'd found someone who actually listened to her, it could cost her custody of Emma. Meanwhile, across town in a dingy sports bar, David Rodriguez nursed his third beer of the afternoon, staring at his phone screen filled with missed calls from his attorney. At 36, the construction foreman still had the broad shoulders and calloused hands that had once made Maria feel safe. But his face had hardened over the years, etched with lines of disappointment and rage. "You gonna answer that thing, or what?" asked his buddy Mike, gesturing at the persistently ringing phone. "It's just more lawyers wanting to crucify me," David muttered, taking another long drink. "They're painting me like some kind of monster. I work 60 hours a week to provide for my family, and what do I get? My wife shacking up with some banker Boy Scout while trying to steal my kid." What David couldn't see, wouldn't acknowledge, was how his drinking had transformed their family dinners from joyful gatherings into tense, silent affairs. Emma had learned to gauge his mood by the number of empty bottles in the recycling bin. She'd started hiding in her room when his voice got too loud, when the arguments with Maria stretched past midnight. The breaking point had come on a snowy January evening. David had promised to attend Emma's school play, her first speaking role, as a flower in the spring pageant. Maria had worked an extra shift to trade for the evening off, and Emma had practiced her 3 lines for weeks. But David never showed. He'd stopped at Murphy's Tavern for just one drink after work and lost track of time. When he stumbled home at 9 p.m., he found Emma still in her flower costume, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy missed it," she'd whispered to Maria. All the other daddies were there. That night, Maria made the call to her attorney, Dr. Sarah. Chun's evaluation painted a clinical but heartbreaking picture of Emma's deterioration. The child psychologist's notes documented a dramatic personality change. Subject Emma Rodriguez has transformed from an outgoing, talkative child to one exhibiting severe withdrawal and selective mutism. Her teacher reports that Emma, previously a classroom leader, an enthusiastic participant, now sits silently during group activities and has stopped raising her hand entirely. The evaluation continued. Emma's drawings have changed significantly. Previous artwork showed bright colors, smiling faces, and family scenes. Current drawings are predominantly black and gray, featuring storms, broken objects, and figures that appear to be crying or hiding. When asked about these images, Emma provides no verbal response, but it was Emma's behavioral changes at home that most concerned the professionals involved in the case. Maria's testimony to Child Protective Services revealed troubling details. She stopped asking for her favorite foods. Used to love Saturday morning pancakes with David, but now she just pushes them around her plate. She won't play with her soccer ball anymore. David coached her team, and I think it reminds her of better times. Even more alarming was Emma's apparent attempt to fix her parents' relationship. "I found her little diary," Maria had told Dr. Chun through tears. She wrote things like how to make mommy and daddy happy again and ways to be a better daughter. She thinks this is her fault. The custody evaluators interviewed Emma's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who provided additional devastating testimony. "Emma used to be my little helper, always eager to answer questions and help other students. Now she communicates only through nods and head shakes. During recess, she sits alone by the fence, apparently talking to herself. When I approached to listen, I realized she was having an entire conversation about her parents, but speaking so quietly, I could barely hear her." It was Mrs. Patterson who first suggested that Emma might respond to animal-assisted therapy. "We had a reading program with therapy dogs, and Emma was the only child who actually smiled during the visits. She seemed to connect with the animals in a way she couldn't with people anymore. Child Protective Services assigned Bailey 3 months into the custody proceedings, and the change was immediate. Lisa Park, Bailey's handler, documented their first meeting. Emma approached Bailey cautiously, but showed immediate interest. Within 10 minutes, she was whispering to him. Within an hour, she was having full conversations about school, her parents, her fears. The child has a voice. She just needs to feel safe enough to use it. But safety was exactly what Emma couldn't find in her fractured world, where every adult conversation seemed to revolve around custody schedules, court dates, and who would get what. The little girl who once chattered constantly about everything from playground adventures to cartoon characters had retreated into silence, trusting only Bailey with her deepest fears and desperate wishes. As the custody battle intensified, Emma's world grew smaller and quieter, until the only honest conversations she had were whispered into the golden fur of a therapy dog who listened without judgment and loved without conditions. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Courtroom 3A as Lisa Park adjusted Bailey's specially designed court vest one final time. The golden retriever sat perfectly still, his intelligent amber eyes scanning the room with professional calm. At 3 years old, Bailey was in his prime, not just as a golden retriever, but as one of only 12 courthouse therapy dogs certified in the entire state of Ohio. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Williams announced to the packed courtroom, "Before we begin today's proceedings, I want Miss Park to explain exactly what we're dealing with here. This is unprecedented in my courtroom, and I want everyone to understand the protocols." Lisa Park stood confidently beside Bailey, her credentials as impressive as her canine partners. A former child psychologist turned animal behaviorist, she'd spent the last 5 years developing specialized training programs for courthouse therapy animals. Her voice carried the authority of someone who testified in over 200 cases across 3 states. "Thank you, Your Honor. Bailey is not an emotional support animal or a service dog in the traditional sense. He's what we call a facility therapy dog, specially trained for high-stress legal environments." She gestured to Bailey, who remained motionless despite the crowd of people staring at him. His training began when he was 8 weeks old and took over 2 years to complete. The courtroom was unusually quiet, everyone straining to hear details about this unprecedented arrangement. Even the court reporter seemed fascinated, her fingers poised over her machine as she documented every word. Bailey's training involves several specialized components, Lisa continued. First, stress hormone detection. Dogs naturally have an incredible sense of smell. Over 300 million scent receptors compared to our 6 million. Bailey has been trained to recognize the specific chemical signatures of extreme anxiety, panic attacks, and traumatic stress responses in children. David Rodriguez's attorney, Robert Thompson, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This wasn't the circus act he'd expected to discredit. The science behind Bailey's abilities sounded surprisingly legitimate. When Bailey detects these stress hormones, he's trained in specific response protocols, Lisa explained. He might move closer to provide physical comfort, adjust his position to create a barrier between the child and perceived threats, or in extreme cases, perform what we call grounding techniques, gentle pressure therapy that helps regulate a panicked child's nervous system. Judge Williams leaned forward with interest. "Ms. Park, you mentioned facility training specifically for courtrooms. What does that entail?" "Excellent question, Your Honor. Courtrooms present unique challenges for therapy animals. Bailey has been desensitized to sudden loud noises, gabbles, raised voices, slamming doors. He's trained to ignore distractions like camera flashes, crying, or even physical altercations. Most importantly, he's taught to never leave his assigned position unless specifically commanded by his handler, or if the child he's supporting is in immediate distress. As if to demonstrate, A photographer's camera flashed from the gallery. Bailey's ears twitched slightly, acknowledging the sound, but he remained perfectly still. Several people in the courtroom murmured appreciatively. Bailey has worked with 53 children in legal proceedings, Lisa continued, ranging in age from 4 to 17. These cases have included custody disputes, abuse testimonies, and criminal trials where children were key witnesses. In 87% of cases, children who were previously unable to testify were able to provide crucial testimony with Bailey present. Maria Rodriguez dabbed her eyes with a tissue. She'd seen Bailey with Emma during their therapy sessions, watched her daughter transform from a silent, withdrawn child into someone who whispered secrets and shared feelings with her golden companion. The statistics Lisa cited gave her hope that Emma might finally be able to express her wishes about the custody arrangement. "What about the dog's temperament screening?" asked Jennifer Walsh, Emma's guardian ad litem. "How do you ensure he won't react unpredictably to emotional outbursts?" Bailey underwent extensive temperament testing before training even began, Lisa replied. "We look for dogs with naturally calm dispositions, high intelligence, and what we call emotional intelligence, the ability to read human body language and respond appropriately." Bailey scored in the top percentile in all categories. She knelt beside Bailey and gently lifted his lip to show his teeth. He's also undergone complete medical and dental examinations. Every 6 months, Bailey receives health clearances, behavioral evaluations, and skill assessments. He must pass all tests to maintain his certification. The Golden Retriever's credentials were more impressive than some of the expert witnesses who'd testified in Judge Williams' courtroom. Bailey had certificates in basic obedience, advanced behavioral training, stress detection protocols, courtroom environment adaptation, and something called child trauma response specialization. Bailey's daily routine is carefully managed, Lisa explained. He works a maximum of 4 hours per day, with mandatory breaks every hour. He has his own quiet space in the courthouse, where he can decompress between sessions. He's fed a specialized diet to maintain optimal health, and he lives with me in a carefully controlled environment. No other pets, minimal stressors, regular exercise, and mental stimulation. Thompson finally spoke up. "This all sounds very scientific, Miss Park, but how do we know the dog won't influence the child's testimony? Couldn't the child say what she thinks the dog wants to hear?" Lisa smiled. "That's a common misconception, Mr. Thompson. Bailey doesn't respond to testimony content only to the child's emotional state. He's trained to provide comfort, regardless of what the child says. In fact, studies show that children are more likely to tell the truth when they feel safe and supported, not less likely." Judge Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Miss Park, I need to understand the practical aspects. Where will Bailey be positioned? What if he becomes disruptive?" "Bailey will sit directly beside the witness chair, close enough for Emma to touch him if needed, but not so close as to obstruct court proceedings. If he shows any signs of distress or distraction, I'll immediately remove him from the courtroom." However, in 3 years of courthouse work, Bailey has never needed to be removed from a proceeding. As Lisa spoke, Bailey seemed to sense that he was being discussed. His tail gave the slightest wag, not enough to be distracting, but sufficient to show his gentle, friendly nature. Several people in the gallery smiled, their initial skepticism beginning to soften. "One final point," Lisa added. "Bailey wears this special vest that clearly identifies him as a working therapy animal. Court personnel had been briefed on protocols no one approaches, pets, or distracts him while he's working. His focus must remain entirely on Emma and her emotional needs." The courtroom fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. Bailey represented something entirely new in the legal system, a bridge between the harsh realities of court proceedings and the delicate emotional needs of traumatized children. Judge Williams looked around the courtroom one final time. Very well. Let's bring in Emma Rodriguez and see how this unprecedented arrangement works. The most unusual testimony in Franklin County courthouse history was about to begin. The courtroom held its collective breath as the heavy oak doors slowly opened. Emma Rodriguez appeared first, her small hand gripping Bailey's leather leash so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She wore a simple blue dress that her grandmother had bought specifically for court, something dignified but child-appropriate, but it hung loosely on her diminished frame. The 8-year-old had lost 12 pounds since the custody proceedings began, and her once bright eyes now seemed too large for her pale face. Bailey entered with the fluid grace of a trained professional, his golden coat gleaming under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. His intelligent amber eyes quickly scanned the room, taking in the gallery of strangers, the imposing judge's bench, and the tension that seemed to crackle through the air like static electricity. Most importantly, he sensed Emma's fear, her rapid heartbeat, the stress hormones flooding her system, the way she unconsciously leaned against him for support. "Good morning, Emma," Judge Williams said gently, her usually stern voice softened for the child's benefit. "You can sit right here in this special chair we've arranged for you. Bailey can sit right beside you." The witness chair had been modified for the occasion. Court maintenance had removed the imposing wooden arms and added a soft cushion to make it less intimidating. A small water bowl had been placed discreetly beside the chair for Bailey, though Lisa Park doubted he would need it during the brief testimony session they hoped to achieve. Emma approached the witness stand as if walking through quicksand. Each step seemed to require enormous effort, and twice she stopped completely, causing Bailey to halt and look up at her with patient, understanding eyes. The courtroom was so quiet that everyone could hear the soft click of Bailey's nails on the marble floor, and the rustle of Emma's dress as she finally settled into the chair. Sarah Martinez, Maria's attorney, had volunteered to question Emma first. She'd spent hours preparing, reading books on child psychology, consulting with Dr. Chun on the best approaches for communicating with traumatized children. She'd even practiced with her own 7-year-old niece to perfect her gentle, non-threatening tone. "Hi, Emma," Martinez began, standing several feet away to avoid crowding the child. "My name is Sarah, and I'm here to help your mom. I just want to ask you a few simple questions. Is that okay?" Emma's response was barely perceptible, the slightest nod of her head while her eyes remained fixed on her hands folded in her lap. Bailey adjusted his position slightly, moving closer so that Emma could easily reach down to touch his head if she needed the comfort. "Can you tell me your full name?" Martinez asked, starting with what should have been the easiest question possible. Silence stretched through the courtroom like a taut wire. Emma's lips moved slightly, but no sound emerged. Her breathing became more rapid, and Bailey immediately responded by placing his chin gently on her knee, a grounding technique Lisa Park had trained him to perform when he detected rising anxiety. Martinez waited a full minute before trying again. "Emma, would you like some water? Or maybe we could take a little break." Still nothing. Emma's hand dropped down to stroke Bailey's head, her fingers working through his soft golden fur in repetitive, soothing motions. To the observers in the gallery, it looked like she was petting her dog. But Lisa Park recognized the behavior. Emma was self-regulating, using the physical contact with Bailey to manage her overwhelming stress response. Judge Williams intervened gently. "Ms. Martinez, perhaps we should try a different approach." "Of course, Your Honor." Martinez reached into her briefcase and pulled out a set of colored cards. "Emma, I know talking can be scary. Would you be willing to point to colors instead? If the answer is yes, point to the green card. If it's no, point to the red card." Emma glanced at the cards, then immediately looked away. Her free hand continued stroking Bailey's fur, while the other gripped the side of her chair. The golden retriever sensed her distress increasing and performed another trained response. He shifted, positioned so his warm body was pressed against her legs, providing the deep pressure therapy that could help regulate her nervous system. Robert Thompson, David's attorney, watched this display with growing frustration. He'd built his strategy around getting Emma to express a preference for living with her father, but the child seemed incapable of any form of communication beyond petting her dog. "Your Honor," Thompson said, rising from his chair, "perhaps we need to be more direct. Emma, sweetheart, do you want to live with your daddy? Just nod yes or no." The effect of his louder, more aggressive tone was immediate and devastating. Emma shrank back in her chair, as if she'd been physically struck. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and Bailey immediately stood up, positioning himself as a barrier between Emma and Thompson. The dog's training was evident. He wasn't aggressive or protective in a threatening way, but he was clearly responding to Emma's spike in fear. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Williams said sharply, "please lower your voice and return to your seat. You're frightening the child." Dr. Sarah Chun, who was observing from the gallery, recognized the signs of an impending panic attack. Emma's face had gone completely white, and she was making small whimpering sounds that were barely audible, even in the silent courtroom. Her hand clutched Bailey's fur so tightly that the dog turned, his head to gently lick her wrist, another trained comfort response. Jennifer Walsh, Emma's guardian ad litem, approached the bench. "Your Honor, I request a 15-minute recess. Emma needs time to decompress." But before Judge Williams could respond, something unexpected happened. Emma leaned down close to Bailey's ear and began whispering. The words were so quiet that even the court reporter, sitting less than 6 feet away, had to strain to hear them. "Bailey," Emma's tiny voice was barely a breath, "I'm so scared. Why are all these people looking at me? I just want to go home, but I don't know which home anymore. Mommy cries all the time, and Daddy smells funny and falls asleep. I don't want to pick. Why can't they just be happy like before?" The confession continued for nearly a minute, the longest anyone had heard Emma speak since the custody battle began. But she wasn't talking to the lawyers, the judge, or even her parents. She was confiding in Bailey, the only being in her fractured world who offered unconditional love without demanding anything in return. Lisa Park watched with professional satisfaction as Bailey performed exactly as trained. He listened to Emma's whispered fears without judgment, provided physical comfort without overwhelming her, and remained completely calm despite the highly charged emotional atmosphere of the courtroom. But what none of the adults fully grasped yet was that Emma's whispered conversation with Bailey contained more truth about her emotional state than hours of professional testimony could provide. The child was communicating, just not in the way the legal system was designed to hear. As Emma's whispers faded back to silence, the courtroom remained frozen in a moment that felt both breakthrough and breakdown. They'd heard her voice, but not her testimony. They'd witnessed her trust, but not her preference. The most challenging part of this unprecedented case was yet to come. By the third day of attempted testimony, the tension in courtroom 3A had reached a breaking point. Emma sat in her modified witness chair like a fragile porcelain doll, her small frame dwarfed by the imposing legal machinery surrounding her. Bailey maintained his professional vigil beside her, but even the trained therapy dog seemed to sense that something fundamental was about to shift in the emotional atmosphere of the room. Judge Williams had tried everything she could think of. They'd attempted morning sessions, when Emma might be more rested, afternoon sessions when the courtroom was quieter, even a brief attempt at chambers conferences with just Emma, Bailey, and the judge. Each effort met with the same heartbreaking result, a child so frozen by trauma and conflicted loyalties that she couldn't speak above a whisper, and then only to her golden companion. The media presence outside had intensified. CNN had picked up the story of the silent, girl and her courthouse dog, and legal commentators were debating whether this represented a breakthrough in child advocacy or a dangerous precedent that could be exploited. Inside the courtroom, however, the only thing that mattered was the small figure who held the key to her own future, but seemed unable to turn it. Maria Rodriguez sat behind the plaintiff's table, her nurse's training warring with her maternal instincts. Every fiber of her being wanted to rush to Emma, to scoop her daughter into her arms and carry her away from this legal nightmare. But she also understood that Emma needed to be heard, that the child's voice, however, quiet was the only thing that could end this destructive battle. David Rodriguez occupied the defendant's side of the courtroom, his construction worker's hands clenched into fists of frustration. For 3 days, he'd watched his daughter suffer in silence, and the helplessness was eating him alive. The man who could build houses and move mountains with his bare hands couldn't reach the child he loved more than life itself. Emma, Sarah Martinez tried once more, her voice gentle but edged with desperation. We know this is hard, but everyone here just wants to understand what would make you feel safe and happy. Can you help us understand that? Emma's response was the same as always, a barely perceptible shake of her head, while their fingers worked through Bailey's fur. The golden retriever had learned Emma's patterns over these 3 grueling days. He could predict when her anxiety would spike, when she needed the grounding pressure of his body against her legs, when she was about to retreat completely into herself. But something was different this morning. Bailey's sensitive nose detected changes in the stress hormones filling the courtroom. Not just Emma's familiar scent of fear and confusion, but rising desperation from both parents, frustration from the attorneys, and something that felt dangerously close to breaking point from everyone involved. It was David who snapped first. This is insane, he suddenly roared, jumping to his feet and sending his chair clattering backward. She's my daughter. My little girl. Emma, sweetheart, please. His voice cracked with raw emotion. Just tell them you want to come home with Daddy. Remember our Saturday morning pancakes? Remember how we used to watch cartoons together and you'd fall asleep on my lap? The courtroom erupted in chaos. Robert Thompson tried to restrain his client, but David was beyond reason. Months of pent-up frustration, guilt, and love poured out in a torrent of desperate words. Emma, baby, I know I made mistakes. I know Daddy wasn't perfect, but I love you so much it hurts. I stopped drinking, sweetheart. I've been going to meetings every day. I just want my little girl back. Maria couldn't contain herself any longer. She leaped from her chair, her professional composure completely shattered. Don't you dare pressure her. Can't you see what this is doing to her? She's terrified because of you. Because of your drinking and your anger. My what? David whirled around, his face flushed with rage and pain. My love for my daughter? My desire to be a father? You're the one who walked out. You're the one shacking up with another man, while my daughter needs stability. Stability? Maria's voice reached a pitch that made Bailey's ears flatten against his head. You call coming home drunk every night stability? You call passing out on the couch while your daughter tries to wake you up for bedtime stories stability? Judge Williams was banging her gavel frantically. Order! Order in this courtroom! Bailiff, please! But the dam had burst. Months of suppressed resentment, pain, and desperate love exploded in accusations and counter-accusations that flew across the courtroom like shrapnel. You never supported my construction business. You never supported my nursing career. You turned my daughter against me. You chose alcohol over your family. Through it all, Emma sat frozen in her chair, her small body curled into itself as the 2 people she loved most in the world tore each other apart in front of dozens of strangers. Bailey pressed closer against her legs, providing what comfort he could, but even his specialized training hadn't prepared him for this level of emotional chaos. The shouting match reached its crescendo when David, tears streaming down his face, pointed directly at Emma. "Look what you've done to her. She's disappearing. My happy, laughing little girl is disappearing, and it's because you can't forgive me for being human." Maria's response was equally anguished. "She's disappearing because she's caught between us. Because every time she looks at you, she remembers the man who used to read her bedtime stories, but every time she smells alcohol on your breath, she remembers being scared and confused." The courtroom fell into stunned silence as both parents realized what they'd just done. They'd made their daughter's trauma about their own pain, their own needs, their own guilt and anger. It was in this moment of horrific clarity that Emma finally moved. She leaned down close to Bailey's ear, and this time her whisper was different, more urgent, more desperate, filled with the kind of truth that can only come from a child's broken heart. "Bailey," she whispered, her voice carrying just far enough for the court reporter to catch every devastating word. "Why can't I just have both my parents be happy? I don't want to choose between them. I love Daddy when he's not sick, and I love Mommy when she's not crying. But they're always angry because of me. Maybe if I wasn't here, they could be friends again, like before I was born." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Judge Williams felt her heart stop. Maria's hand flew to her mouth in horror. David staggered backward as if he'd been punched. Bailey, sensing Emma's emotional collapse, immediately shifted into crisis mode, positioning his body to provide maximum comfort and security. But the damage was done. The child's deepest, most devastating fear had been voiced. She believed she was the problem that needed to be solved, the obstacle to her parents' happiness, the reason their love had turned to hate. The courtroom remained frozen in that terrible moment of truth, everyone finally understanding that this had never been about custody schedules or living arrangements. This was about a little girl who thought she was responsible for destroying her parents' love for each other. The most important words of the entire custody battle had finally been spoken, not to the lawyers, not to the judge, but whispered into the golden fur of the only being Emma trusted to hear her pain without adding to it. The silence that followed Emma's whispered confession stretched across courtroom 3 like a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. Court reporter Janet Martinez sat frozen over her stenotype machine, her 30 years of professional experience having never prepared her for words that could break hearts so completely. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reviewed what she'd just transcribed, the black letters on white paper seeming inadequate to capture the devastating innocence of a child's self-blame. Judge Patricia Williams felt something she'd never experienced in 2 decades on the bench, her professional composure completely shattered by the raw truth of what she'd just heard. The child's words echoed in her mind. Maybe if I wasn't here, they could be friends again like before I was born. In all her years of custody battles, restraining orders, and family crisis interventions, she'd never encountered such profound self-sacrifice from someone so young. "Bailiff," Judge Williams managed, her voice barely above a whisper, "please ensure the courtroom remains sealed. No one enters or exits." She needed time to process what had just happened, to figure out how to respond to a moment that had fundamentally changed not just this case, but her understanding of how divorce trauma affects children. Maria Rodriguez stood behind the plaintiff's table, her face drained of all color. The nurse who'd spent years saving lives in emergency rooms felt completely helpless in the face of her daughter's emotional crisis. Emma's whispered words replayed in her mind like a nightmare loop. Her precious daughter, her reason for living, believed the world would be better without her in it. "Oh God," Maria breathed, her hand pressed to her chest as if she could physically hold her breaking heart together. "Emma, baby, no ... David Rodriguez had collapsed into his chair, his head buried in his hands. The construction foreman who'd built his reputation on strength and reliability felt his world crumbling like a poorly laid foundation. His daughter, his little sunshine, his Saturday morning pancake partner, thought she was the problem. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. In trying to fight for Emma, he'd made her feel like a prize to be won, rather than a child to be cherished. Dr. Sarah Chun, observing from the gallery, immediately recognized the clinical implications of Emma's statement. This wasn't just selective mutism or anxiety. This was a child, exhibiting signs of what psychologists call parentification, where a child assumes inappropriate responsibility for adult problems. Combined with Emma's expressed wish to not be here, it raised immediate safety concerns that would require careful intervention. Jennifer Walsh, Emma's guardian ad litem, felt the weight of professional responsibility crushing down on her shoulders. She'd been tasked with representing Emma's best interests, but had anyone truly understood what those interests were until this moment? The child didn't need lawyers arguing about custody schedules. She needed healing from the devastating guilt she'd internalized about her parents' failed marriage. Lisa Park watched Bailey's response with professional concern mixed with pride. The golden retriever had immediately shifted into what she privately called emotional triage mode, his most advanced level of crisis intervention. Bailey's body was pressed firmly against Emma's legs, providing the deep pressure therapy that could help regulate her nervous system, while his positioning created a protective barrier between the child and the chaos of adult emotions swirling around her. Emma remained curled in her witness chair, her small frame seeming to shrink further with each passing second. The words she'd whispered to Bailey had been her deepest secret, the terrible logic that an 8-year-old mind had constructed to make sense of an incomprehensible situation. If Mommy and Daddy had been happy before she was born, and they were fighting about her now, then clearly she was the variable that needed to be removed from the equation. Sarah Martinez, Maria's attorney, felt her legal strategy crumbling as she grappled with the implications of Emma's confession. This wasn't about proving which parent could provide better care. This was about a child who'd absorbed so much guilt about her parents' conflict that she'd begun to view herself as expendable. The family law playbook had no chapter for this kind of revelation. Robert Thompson sat in stunned silence, his usual combative approach suddenly seeming not just inappropriate, but potentially harmful. He'd spent weeks preparing arguments about his client's parental rights and fitness, but Emma's words had exposed the fundamental flaw in adversarial custody proceedings. They positioned children as territories to be won, rather than human beings to be healed. Judge Williams called for a 20-minute recess, but asked that Emma remain in the courtroom with Bailey and Lisa Park. As the adults filed out in shocked silence, the judge approached the witness stand, where Emma sat frozen in her chair. "Emma," Judge Williams said, kneeling down to bring herself to the child's eye level, "I need you to listen to me very carefully, sweetheart. What you just told Bailey about thinking your parents would be happier if you weren't here, that's not true. That's not true at all." Emma's eyes remained fixed on Bailey's golden fur, but Judge Williams noticed the slightest shift in her posture, indicating she was listening. "Sometimes when grown-ups have problems, children think it's their fault," the judge continued, her voice gentle but firm. "But Emma, your parents' problems are grown-up problems that started long before this courtroom, and they have nothing to do with you being born. Nothing." Dr. Chon had quietly remained in the gallery, and now approached with Judge Williams' permission. "Emma," she said softly, "can you look at Bailey's face for a moment? Look at how calm and happy he is just being with you. That's because Bailey knows something very important. He knows that you make the world better just by being in it." For the first time in 3 days, Emma lifted her head slightly. Bailey, sensing the shift, gently nuzzled her hand with his wet nose, a spontaneous gesture of affection that wasn't part of his training, but came from something deeper. "Your mommy and daddy are fighting about who gets to take care of you because you're the most precious thing in their lives. Dr. Chun continued. They're not fighting because they don't want you. They're fighting because they both want you, so much that they forgot how to share. Emma's whispered response was barely audible, but Janet Martinez caught every word on her machine. But they're so sad all the time now. Judge Williams felt tears prick her eyes. Yes, sweetheart, they're sad. But they're not sad because of you. They're sad because they lost each other, and they don't know how to be a family in a different way. That's a grown-up problem that grown-ups have to fix. The courtroom had become an impromptu therapy session, with legal protocols abandoned in favor of emergency emotional intervention. Emma's confession had shifted the entire case from a custody dispute to a child mental health crisis, requiring immediate and careful response. As the recess time expired and attorneys filed back into the courtroom, everyone understood that they were no longer dealing with a typical family law case. They were confronting the devastating reality of how adult conflicts can warp a child's understanding of their own worth and place in the world. Emma's whispered truth had changed everything, and there would be no going back to legal arguments about parenting time in residential custody. The only question now was how to heal a little girl who'd convinced herself she was the problem rather than the solution. The small conference room adjacent to Courtroom 3A had never witnessed a meeting quite like this one. For the first time in 6 months of bitter legal warfare, Maria and David Rodriguez sat across from each other without their attorneys present, without legal briefs or custody evaluations spread between them. Just two broken parents and the devastating echo of their daughter's whispered words. Maybe if I wasn't here, they could be friends again. Maria stared at her hands, still trembling from Emma's confession. Her nurse's training had taught her to recognize trauma symptoms, but she'd been so focused on protecting Emma from David's drinking that she'd missed the deeper wound, her daughter's conviction that she was the source of all their pain. She thinks it's her fault, Maria whispered, her voice barely audible in the sterile conference room. Our little girl thinks she broke our marriage. David sat slumped in his chair, his construction worker's hands that had built countless homes for other families hanging uselessly at his sides. The man who'd spent months fighting for his parental rights now understood that his daughter didn't see herself as someone worth fighting for. She saw herself as a problem to be solved. I made her feel like a trophy, David said, his voice thick with self-loathing. Every time I argued for custody, every time I talked about my rights as her father, I was treating her like something to be won instead of someone to be loved. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 6 months of legal battles that had accomplished nothing except convincing an 8-year-old that she was responsible for her parents' unhappiness. Through the conference room's small window, they could see reporters still gathered on the courthouse steps, waiting for updates on the Silent Girl case that had captured national attention. Dr. Sarah Chun entered quietly, carrying Emma's file and a folder of drawings the child had made during their therapy sessions. Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez, I need you to see something before we return to court. She spread Emma's artwork across the conference table like evidence at a crime scene. The progression was heartbreaking. Drawings from before the divorce showed bright colors, smiling stick figures labeled Mommy, Daddy, and me, holding hands under a yellow sun. But as the custody battle intensified, the drawings had grown increasingly dark. This one is from last week, Dr. Chun said, pointing to a drawing that made Maria gasp and David push back from the table in horror. It showed 2 large figures, clearly the parents facing each other, with angry red scribbles between them. But where the child should have been in the family picture, there was only empty white space. Emma has literally erased herself from her own family, Dr. Chun explained, her professional composure barely containing her own emotional response to the child's psychological state. In her mind, she's already gone. She's practicing disappearing because she believes it will make you both happier. Maria covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. All those months of working extra shifts to pay legal fees. All those nights spent documenting David's drinking incidents. All those hours of coaching Emma for supervised visits. None of it had been about Emma's well-being. It had all been about winning. "I was so focused on protecting her from you," Maria said to David, her voice muffled by her hands, "that I never realized I was teaching her that love comes with conditions. That she had to choose sides to be safe." David stared at the empty space in Emma's drawing, where she should have been. "And I was so focused on proving I deserved her that I never asked what she needed from me. I just kept demanding my rights as her father, without earning her trust back." Dr. Chun pulled out another folder, this one containing transcripts of Emma's whispered conversations with Bailey during their therapy sessions. Emma talks to Bailey constantly. She processes her entire emotional world through those conversations. "Would you like to know what she's been saying?" Both parents nodded, though they looked like they were bracing for physical blows. "She talks about missing Saturday morning pancakes with Daddy, but being scared when you smell different," Dr. Chun read from her notes. Looking at David, "She loves that you're strong enough to lift her up to reach high shelves, but she worries that you're too sad to play anymore." David's face crumpled as he recognized his daughter's perceptive observations about his drinking and depression. Dr. Chun turned to Maria. "She admires how you help people at the hospital and wishes she could be brave like Mommy. But she's confused about why Mommy cries so much now, and she's worried that James, your boyfriend, will leave too if she's not a good enough daughter." "Oh God," Maria breathed. "She thinks she has to earn love from everyone now. She thinks she's not enough just as she is." "That's exactly right," Dr. Chun confirmed. "Emma has developed what we call hypervigilance around adult emotions. She's constantly monitoring both of your moods, trying to figure out how to make you happy, believing that your sadness is her responsibility to fix." The truth was devastating in its simplicity. While Maria and David had been fighting over who loved Emma more, they'd inadvertently taught her that adult love was conditional, fragile, and dependent on her behavior. She'd learned to see herself not as a cherished daughter, but as a burden that needed to justify its existence. "There's something else," Dr. Chun said gently. "Emma has been asking Bailey what happens to little girls whose parents can't stop fighting. She's been researching, in her 8-year-old way, what it means when children go to live somewhere else. She's preparing herself for abandonment because she believes it's inevitable." David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where he stared out at the media circus below. "We did this," he said, his voice hollow. "We created a custody battle and forgot there was an actual child in the middle of it. We made her feel like she was the prize instead of the person we should have been protecting." Maria joined him at the window, standing closer to her estranged husband than she had in over a year. "She doesn't need us to fight for her," she said quietly. "She needs us to fight for her healing, for her sense of worth, for her belief that she deserves love just for being Emma." "But how?" David asked, turning to face the psychologist. "How do we fix what we've broken? How do we convince our daughter that she's not the problem?" Dr. Chun smiled for the first time since Emma's case had begun. "You start by showing her that you can work together as her parents, even if you can't be married to each other. You show her that your love for her isn't dependent on custody schedules or court orders. And most importantly, you help her understand that your problems are adult problems that adults need to solve." Through the conference room's thin walls, they could hear Bailey's gentle whining from the courtroom, where he remained with Emma and Lisa Park. Even the therapy dog seemed to understand that something fundamental needed to change. "When we go back in there," Maria said, her voice stronger than it had been in months, "we're not going as adversaries fighting over Emma. We're going as her parents, united in helping her heal from what we've put her through." David nodded, extending his hand to his ex-wife, not as a romantic gesture, but as a parenting partner. For Emma, Maria took his hand firmly. For Emma, as they prepared to return to the courtroom, both parents understood that the custody battle was over. The healing had to begin. The small conference room next to Courtroom 3A had never witnessed a meeting quite like this one. For 6 long months, the Rodriguez family had been locked in a grueling legal battle-bitter custody hearings, tense courtroom standoffs, and endless paperwork. But now, for the first time, Maria and David sat quietly across from each other without attorneys, without legal briefs, and without accusations flying between them. Just 2 exhausted parents, joined by the unspoken truth their daughter had quietly revealed during the trial. Maybe if I wasn't here, they could be friends again. Maria's hands trembled as she folded them in her lap, still raw from the weight of Emma's words. As a nurse, she knew the signs of trauma, but she hadn't fully realized how deep Emma's wounds ran until that fragile confession. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Her little girl believed she was the cause of her parents' broken marriage. The idea made Maria's chest tighten with a painful mix of guilt and sorrow. "She thinks it's her fault," Maria whispered, barely audible in the sterile, dimly lit room. "Our daughter thinks she broke us." David slumped further into his chair, the rough calluses on his hands, made from years of building homes, now useless in this moment of helplessness. The man who had fought fiercely for custody was suddenly stripped bare by the painful truth that Emma didn't see herself as someone to be fought for. She saw herself as a problem to be solved. "I treated her like a trophy," David admitted, voice thick with regret. "Every time I argued for custody, I talked about my rights as her father, but I never stopped to think about what she needed. I was fighting for ownership, not love." The silence stretched between them, heavy with 6 months of relentless courtroom battles that had accomplished nothing except convincing an 8-year-old that she was responsible for her parents' unhappiness. Outside, through the window, reporters still gathered, their cameras pointed at the courthouse steps, hungry for updates on the silent girl case that had captured the nation's heart. Dr. Sarah Chun, the child psychologist assigned to Emma's case, entered quietly. Her calm demeanor masked the depth of the emotional weight she carried. In her hands were Emma's therapy files and a folder filled with drawings the child had made throughout their sessions. "Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez," Dr. Chun began gently, "before we return to court, I want to show you something important." She carefully spread Emma's artwork across the table. At first glance, the drawings seemed innocent stick figures under bright suns, smiling faces labeled Mommy, Daddy, and me. But as the weeks progressed, the colors faded and darkness crept in. Figures grew distant, angry scribbles replaced smiles, and most heartbreakingly, a figure representing Emma began to disappear. "This drawing was made last week," Dr. Chun said softly, pointing to the latest piece. 2 large figures, clearly the parents, stood facing each other with angry red lines between them. But where Emma should have been, there was only empty white space. Maria gasped. David recoiled slightly. "She's erased herself," Dr. Chun explained, her voice thick with emotion. "Emma is practicing disappearing, preparing herself for a world without a place in it." Maria's shoulders shook as silent tears streamed down her face. All those months she had spent fighting to protect Emma from David's drinking, from his supposed neglect, had blinded her to the deeper damage. The constant conflict had taught Emma that love came with conditions, that she had to choose sides, or worse, disappear entirely. "I was so focused on shielding her from you," Maria said, voice cracking, "that I forgot to teach her unconditional love." David looked down at the empty space on the paper. "And I was so caught up in proving my rights, I never stopped to ask if Emma felt safe with me. I treated her like a prize to win rather than a daughter to cherish." Dr. Chun then pulled out transcripts from Emma's quiet, whispered conversations with her therapy dog, Bailey, her steadfast companion, who had helped her voice feelings too heavy for words. She talks to Bailey constantly, Dr. Chon explained. She shares memories of Saturday morning pancakes with her dad, but also her fear when she smells different on him when he drinks too much. She admires her mom's strength, but worries about the tears she sees. And she's afraid that your boyfriend James will leave like her dad might. The room fell into a heavy silence. David's face crumpled as he realized the full extent of the emotional turmoil his daughter had been hiding. Maria swallowed hard, realizing her tears had become a constant backdrop to Emma's fragile world. Emma believes she has to earn love from all of us, Dr. Chun continued. She monitors your moods like a little adult, always trying to fix your sadness, thinking her feelings are the cause of it. The truth was devastatingly simple. In their fight over custody, Maria and David had unwittingly taught Emma that adult love was conditional, fragile, and dependent on her behavior. Instead of a daughter, she saw herself as a burden, a problem. There's more, Dr. Chon said softly, pulling out a final folder. Emma has been asking Bailey what happens to children when parents keep fighting. She's preparing herself for abandonment, believing she will be sent away. David stood abruptly, staring out the window at the reporters still waiting for news. "We did this," he said hollowly. "We forgot there was a child at the center of this battle. We made her feel like a prize instead of the person who needs us most." Maria stood beside him, closer than she had been in months, the walls between them beginning to crack. "She doesn't need us to fight over her," she said quietly. "She needs us to fight for her healing, for her self-worth, for her belief that she deserves love just for being Emma. How do we fix this?" David asked, turning to Dr. Chun, desperation clear in his voice. "How do we convince our daughter she's not the problem?" For the first time, Dr. Chun smiled a gentle, hopeful smile. "You start by working together as her parents, even if you can't be husband and wife. You show Emma your love isn't about court orders or custody schedules. And you help her understand that the problems between you are adult problems. Adults have to solve those. She shouldn't carry that weight." Outside the conference room, the soft whine of Bailey, the therapy dog, reminded everyone of the fragile hope in the room. Even he seemed to sense that the battle was shifting from conflict to healing. Maria's voice was steady now, stronger than it had been in months. "When we go back in there, we're not adversaries fighting over Emma. We're her parents, united in helping her heal." David extended his hand, not as a sign of romance, but partnership. "For Emma," Maria took it firmly. "For Emma." As they rose to return to the courtroom, the heavy fight was over. A new journey had begun, one of healing, hope, and love that was unconditional.